Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Catlin Morgan, Education Manager for Institute on Aging, and we'd like to welcome you to this Institute on Aging program supported by AARP California, for which we're very grateful. IOA is an organization devoted to helping older and disabled adults remain independent for as long as possible through an assortment of home-based services, including our new service, Compania, which is a program designed to personally guide family caregivers through the unpredictable complexities of caring for a person with dementia. You can find out more about this program and all of our programs at www.ioaging.org. Today, in Beyond the Burnout, we invite you to hear three voices address the topic of caregiver burnout from their own unique perspectives, and you'll be able to add your own voice to the mix too. This is a big topic, and we will not be able to address everything about caregiver burnout within this session, but we hope that today's presentation provides ideas and inspiration for support of oneself, one's clients, and one's loved ones. I'm going to introduce the panelists who will in turn make individual presentations, after which they may answer a question or so. And after the three have presented, they will open their screens and come together as a panel to discuss and ask one another questions, and we'll add your own questions to the mix too. Before we go to the individual presentations, I'd like to introduce each of our wonderful guests today. We have Roy Reamer from the Zen Caregiving Project. He's the executive director and has been an end-of-life caregiver and educator since 1997. He trained with the Zen Hospice Project to become a volunteer and served for 6 years at Guest House Facility before serving for 7 years on San Francisco's Laguna Honda Hospital Palliative Care Ward. You'll find more about what he's doing when I send you information after this, but he is also certified by the Stanford University School of Medicine, Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and the Compassion Institute as a Compassion Cultivation Training Instructor. Welcome, Roy. Lily Liu is a family caregiver for her mother who has a chronic illness. And in 2015, Lily took a hiatus from the workplace to set up the infrastructure of care for her mom. Prior to that, Lily worked at AARP, most recently as AARP's historian and archivist, collecting, preserving, and storytelling about the history of AARP. She has a rich history with AARP and has been the award-winning editor of the staff newsletter there. Thank you, Lily, for being with us today. And our keynote speaker, Patty Davis, is an author, journalist, and screenwriter. Her latest book, Floating in the Deep End, How Caregivers Can See Beyond Alzheimer's, is informed by the caregiving journey she took in support of her father, Ronald Reagan. She's published nonfiction books as well as fiction, and she writes frequently for the Washington Post. In fact, I think there's a recent article there that you should check out by her as well. When Patty's father, the 40th president of the United States, announced his Alzheimer's diagnosis in an address to the American public in 1994, a brave thing to do, the world had not yet been speaking about this cruel, mysterious disease. Yet overnight, he and his family became the face of Alzheimer's, and Patty, once content to keep her family at arm's length, quickly moved across the country to be present during her father's journey to the end of life. Thank you for Patty for being with us today. And now our presenters, except for Roy, will close their screens and Roy will begin his presentation. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's wonderful to be here with you all today and to share with you a little bit of what I've learned about family caregiving and the burden of caregiving, and some things we can do to alleviate some of that burden. So I really want to just acknowledge the challenges of being a caregiver, especially in this time, in this context of COVID that we're still very much living within. So I understand that there are both paid professional clinical caregivers with us today, but also a number of family caregivers. And what I have to say will focus primarily on the role of family caregivers and their experience, but I think what I have to share will be relevant to all caregivers. So today, our forum is really focused on looking at burnout and the issues of burnout when it comes to caregiving. And so from the get-go, I just want to name one of the contributing factors to caregiver burden and burnout, and that is the issue of social isolation. So with the caregivers who we work with at my organization, we always hear that the social isolation is a huge issue that people are dealing with. And this is really, this is not simply the absence of having people to connect with other than the person who you're caring for, but also the absence of people, with whom you can share the challenges that you face as a caregiver. So you may be very much in touch with other family members and friends, but you may find that they're not really available to hear or witness your story as a caregiver. And this can really take its toll on the stress and the burden that family caregiving can present. So, for some of our friends and family, they don't have the time to spend with us, or it could be that simply hearing the story of caring for a loved one can really trigger or bring up a lot of fear. Fear for when they may find themselves in a similar situation, or it may bring up past trauma that they've experienced when they were in the role that perhaps has not been processed fully or resolved. It could be that those people who are in your life, even there to support you, may really not be used to being a listening presence. So listening is a skill that can be quite challenging in this day and age where we're constantly bombarded with so many distractions. So not everyone has really cultivated this skill. And I think it's fair to say that when we're in the presence of someone who hasn't really cultivated the skills to listen with presence and an open heart, we can actually feel more isolated and more lonely. It could be that some of the people in your life who you might reach out to otherwise, they simply can't relate, or they simply can't empathize because they've not yet been in the role, and so they don't really have a good understanding of what it is that you're going through when you're a family caregiver. So also, one of the big issues is when you're caring for a partner who's been the primary social contact, it's quite likely that other social connections in your life have not been maintained. And I think this is particularly true when we reach our older years, when friends and even family fall away or move away. And it can be difficult to establish new friendships. So when the person we're caring for begins to be less available due to their illness, it can leave us in isolation. I would say it's important, extremely important, for caregivers to connect with other caregivers and to be able to process their experience with other caregivers. And in the mindful caregiving courses that we offer at Zen Caregiving Project, we find that the opportunity to connect with other caregivers is one of the three primary benefits of participation in our courses, along with the skills that are taught and the respite from caregiving. So connecting with other caregivers is extremely important. When it comes to the health and well-being of caregivers, I would say, this is an issue. This is a problem that we really need to figure out. Um, as you're all aware, I'm sure, this issue really of family caregiving touches everyone in our society. If you're not currently, or if you've not been a family caregiver, it's quite likely that you will be at some point. And, it's so prevalent in our country. I would say our health system really depends on family caregivers for its proper functioning and success. So in just to offer you some more context, in 2020, AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving found that 48 million Americans have provided unpaid care for someone over the age of 18 over the last 12 months. So this is 1 in 5 Americans. And this is up about 9 million from their 2015 study. So the number of family caregivers is growing in our society. And as I say, our health system is really dependent upon these caregivers. So actually, the well-being of family caregivers really impacts the well-being of paid caregivers. So in a macro sense, if not an individual sense, the family caregivers and the paid or professional clinical caregivers really work hand in hand with each other to care for those people who need support in our society. It's also, I think, worth noting that 93% of older adults who are family caregivers did not report receiving any related training before moving into the role of family caregiver. So to me, that's quite remarkable. So it's fair to say most people simply aren't prepared to be in the role from a practical or from an emotional point of view. So the AARP NAC study also shows that 4 in 10 caregivers are in what we would describe as high burden care situations. So burden level depends on the number of hours that are spent caregiving, but also the type of illness of the person who's receiving care. And these caregivers who are in high burden situations are really the most likely to burn out and to become ill, actually, in the role. So who is in this category? So these are people who typically are caregivers who are providing 21 or more hours per week of care. And these are people who typically report that they feel as though they have no choice in being in the role of caregiver. And most of these people are also caring for someone with cognitive impairment, like a dementia diagnosis, which we'll be hearing more about later in the forum. So it stands to reason, and actually research shows, that being a high burden caregiver actually sets us up for negative health impacts. So we're much more likely to get sick and actually burn out. Now, I do want to say that caregiving for a family member, for a loved one, for a friend is not inherently burdensome. It's not necessarily high burden. Caregiving, of course, can provide so much meaning and purpose in our lives. And many caregivers can actually feel really good about being in the role, especially in the early stages. But the longer we're in the role and the more time we spend providing care, the more likely we are to experience burnout. So first, what is burnout? So I would describe it as physical, mental, or emotional exhaustion, or really some combination of the above. And caregivers may begin to express attitudes of not caring, defeat, or apathy. And what are the warning signs that someone is in a situation that can likely lead to burnout, even if they're not there presently? Well, a caregiver who may be assuming too much responsibility for care or the well-being of the person they're caring for, or someone who is confused about their role vis-a-vis the person in need of care. It could be someone who's expressing unrealistic expectations over the impact that they have on the health or well-being of the person needing care. So let us remember, we may not be able to fix the situation that our loved one is in. Or someone who is sharing their sense of overwhelm or lack of control over the resources necessary for care. So these are all signs that someone may be heading towards burnout. And so how do we know if someone is experiencing burnout? Well, they may display withdrawal from their usual social connections, or irritability or hopelessness, or frequent bouts with illness, perhaps weight loss or change in appetite, or physical or emotional exhaustion. And let us remember that when the primary caregiver goes down, so to speak, it has a huge impact on the care of the person they've been caring for. Thus, it's really important for us all to promote and work towards caregiver wellness. So what can we do to prevent caregiver burnout? Well, we can certainly encourage self-care practices, remembering that even incremental changes to daily habits can make a big difference. And it can be easier to create a self-care plan when we break it down into 5 areas. Physical, the most obvious, but emotional, relational, spiritual, and even attitudinal. And we can provide resources that connect burdened caregivers with other caregivers. We can assist in getting respite care in place on a regular basis. Or we can help caregivers find someone with whom they can share their caregiving stories or struggles. Caregivers need to tell their stories, as we're going to hear more about a little bit later. And this really lightens the load of caregiving. So we can also encourage caregivers, or we can practice self-compassion. Caregiving can be really difficult, as you know. So simply to acknowledge the difficulty, to remember that being human means we will struggle from time to time, and to be kind to ourselves. This can really help in moments of difficulty. And we can encourage short periods of sitting quietly and following the breath. So let's try this together. So we'll engage in a short meditation just for a couple moments. And whatever your day has been like so far, whatever you're experiencing in this moment, try to take the next couple moments as a break, to just find some freedom to whatever may be burdening you or creating stress in your life. So let's just take a moment. And if you're in a situation where it's comfortable for you, I invite you to close your eyes. And we'll just begin to go internal. I like to say we're beginning to quiet the thinking mind, and we're awakening the sensing mind. So just beginning to notice, what is it like to be in this body in this moment? What do you notice? Perhaps you notice points of contact between the body and whatever chair you're sitting in. You might be reclining, noticing the back body as it feels support. If your feet are touching the floor, you might sense into that point of contact. And there's no wrong way to do this. We're just simply observing our present moment experience. And if you've not already, let your attention find its way to the in-breath and to the out-breath. Not changing the breath, but just observing. Noticing the breath as it moves into the nostrils and through the throat, into the chest area. And then as it leaves through the mouth or through the nostrils. Just perceiving the subtle sensations associated with breathing in and breathing out. And when you notice thoughts beginning to pull you away from sensing, just notice, let go of those thoughts, and come back to the breath. In this way, we're really using the breath, we're using the body as a refuge, as a place we can turn to when we're experiencing a busy mind, when we're experiencing chaos within or without. The breath is always available to us. And I'll sound this meditation bowl and we'll come back to the screen together. So I invite you to try this out on your own. You may think that you need to set aside 30 minutes or something for meditation, but you don't. You can even just take a break during your busy day to follow 3 intentional breaths. And this really makes a difference. You can try it as a little thought experiment. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time.
Roy, thank you
Caitlin.
very much for setting the tone and providing those tremendously interesting statistics for all of us. What I'd like to do at this time is then ask you a question. I
Please.
think that you actually had a question for the audience. I'm going to put that question in the chat right now. Let's see if it flies. Or you know what? I guess I can just ask it also. The question that Roy has for the audience, and you can type your answer in the chat. Is there anyone in your family or community who could benefit from learning from what you have learned about being a caregiver? Is there anyone in your family or community who could benefit from learning from you about what you have learned about being a caregiver? Please type your answers in the chat. We're very interested in seeing your answers, and we will refer to them a little bit later. So as those answers come in, I want to thank you again, Roy, for your presentation. If you'll close your screen,
Great.
and Lily will open hers. Thank you. Lily, thank you. And unmute yourself too, so we can hear your beautiful presentation. So Lily, without further ado, I'll mute myself and stop my video and let you.
Thank you so much, Catlin. And thank you, Mr. Reamer. Boy, did I really need that. You shared such wisdoms, and I am so grateful. It is indeed a true honor for me today to share the microphone with Mr. Reamer and especially with Ms. Davis. I wanted to thank AARP California, not only for making this collaboration possible, but because they had mailed me a copy of Ms. Davis's beautiful new book. And as you can see, I actually ran out of sticky notes because there were so many wonderful tips and stories in it. I'm Lily Liu, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. So as of now, I'm ahead 3 hours. I have already had a very busy day. So Mr. Reamer's mindfulness was a wonderful exercise, and I already feel much better, really. So I am a family caregiver for a 90-year-old mother who has had Parkinson's now for more than 40 years and was recently diagnosed with dementia. I made the decision a year ago when the pandemic really ramped up in the early fall that I was not going to have a paid caregiver come in like I had already had for many years for 8 hours to reduce the risk of infection. So I have been caring for my mother all by myself for 12 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, but who's counting, right? So any of you who are in the same shoes that I am, please put in the chat for whom you're caring and how are you doing today? I was so honored to have this opportunity to share my story because Catlin always curates such wonderful events where there's a mixture of family caregivers and professionals who are helping us. And so what I hope to contribute to the conversation today are 3 quick points. I'm in the trenches. I'm in the horrible trenches of being a family caregiver by myself, isolated, just like Mr. Roy said, in this pandemic. I am burnt out, and I really want to know, as the title of this gathering says, how do I get beyond the burnout? Number 2, I would like to share my journey as a family caregiver. I've recognized now that I used to talk about it because I want to become an advocate for all of us now. I used to use PowerPoints. I used to use bullet points. No, I have recognized now that storytelling really helps. It's a powerful way to increase awareness of this situation that we're all facing. As Mr. Roy had said, there is a larger demographic shift, and we're all part of it. And then number 3, I come with a learner's mind because I'm eager to learn tips on self-care. How do I avoid and how do I handle burnout? So my situation is I am caring for a mom because my father passed away suddenly 10 years, more than 10 years ago now. So I had been doing it long distance. You know how it is. You take time out of work on vacation to go and check on them. But Daddy was gone in less than 5 weeks. So I've now experienced the only 2 types of illness that we have in the world: acute for Daddy, gone in 5 weeks, and now mother, chronic, a 40-year debilitating Parkinson's disease. So that means then that I'm in a marathon, not a sprint. So burnout is hanging over us very, very bad for all of us. So I'm a relatively private person. Why did I make my decision to add my voice to our community of family caregivers? Well, as you all know, sitting in California or anywhere in America after the 2020 census, we know that the face of America is changing. We're growing more diverse. And especially the professionals now joining us today realize you're on the front lines of handling much more multicultural, different lived experiences. So I hope to share some of my learnings as you think about caring for a more multicultural America. Our family came, it's that, immigration story of so many. President Johnson had changed the immigration law in 1965. And subsequently, so many of us from Asia, God bless America, were able to come, parents who came to do graduate studies and offered an opportunity to stay on. So I parse out my profile very, very definitively. I am a 1.5 generation immigrant family caregiver. What does that mean? Well, immigrant, that means we came as a nuclear family. I do not have a cousin Sue in Iowa that I can call to come and give me respite. Small nuclear families. The 1.5 generation is a key point because I'm not a first generation like my parents. So there's linguistic barriers for someone who's first generation. I came as a young child. I started elementary school in America, but I'm also not a 2.0, a second generation child who often is more acculturated, assimilated, whatever the term you'd like to use. I've worked very hard to learn Mandarin Chinese so as to meet my parents halfway to understand their life story. So being from a Chinese American family, then you understand that there will be cultural norms and traditions, which we half understand, but that do hover over us. One of which is the concept of filial piety. In Mandarin, we say xiao. Even if I didn't read Confucius, there is an expectation almost in my DNA that I will care for the elders in our family. And especially when you mention family, it's a small one, right? So I have learned that wonderful phrase that we now use, family by choice. And so I hope she's on. I did invite. I have a woman who I met at work, and we've now known each other for 25 years. She's my elder sister, a woman from the Midwest, just like Ms. Davis mentioned in her lovely book. Her father is a Midwesterner. There's something very special about American Midwesterners. She's what I call my accountability coach. The burnout issues are such that you may know the doctor gave you an order to go and get a mammogram, but my big sister will say, her name is Maxine, Lily, did you actually make the appointment? So we need people like that before we reach burnout and illness, because they're like our accountability coaches. And then the linguistic barriers. I mean, Ms. Davis mentioned this already, how tough it is. MRI, UTI, ADLs, those are hardly understandable in English to those of us who know English. Can you imagine trying to interpret and change that into another language? And of course, then you know the power dynamic shifts when you care for someone, right? You almost become a parent of your parent. And then I'm still now just starting to explore the issues of trauma. Those of us who are immigrants from Asia, the 20th century was total trauma for our parents and grandparents, war, civil strife, upheaval. So I'm still learning about that, but that has huge implications for all of us as family caregivers. So why did I then want to come out, show my face, hear my voice in this community is because of representation. We have to let others know what our lived experience is. That helps the professionals, and it gives a sense of community to others who may be having all these issues but feel so isolated. So what I've started doing is in my speeches, I go on stage wearing this pin. I've made my journey a journey from being a dragging daughter, DRAGGING, dragging with fatigue, dragging with worry. But if we empower ourselves with information and resources, and there's so much out there for us as family caregivers, truly, God bless America. As much as we might identify issues, there still is a lot. Then I become the dragon daughter, empowered and able to help the ones that I'm caring for. So this is where I've realized that storytelling is helpful as we make our case. Maybe we're testifying on the Hill, or maybe we're just talking to a doctor. It makes our points more relatable, and it makes them more easily remembered. So coming to this forum today, and thank you so much, Institute on Aging. I come with a learner's mind because I think the first and most important thing I'm learning is to give myself grace. I put it this way because my parents literally walked out of China on their feet and then were detained for 5 years in a refugee camp in French Indochina, not yet Vietnam. It was still a French colony. So growing up, we had a joke in our family where my mother, before we got our driver's licenses, might have forgotten to buy some bread. And she'd say, walk to the grocery store and get us some bread. And we'd say, oh, Mom, it's so far to walk. It's so long a trip. She'd stand up all 4'11" of herself and she'd say, if I can walk out of China, you can walk to the grocery store for us. So I say this half in jest because I'm giving myself grace that my resilience meter does not have to be as high as a parent who walked out of China. We have to calibrate for ourselves when we're getting close to burnout, when we need to seek help. And that's why I just wanted to say that being able to have this book by Ms. Davis is just been a gift. It is a beautiful book. It's a tour de force. And I just think, the Zen Hospice and the Zen Caregiving Project has taught us about the word in Chinese Mandarin is Chan, Zen. There's the thought of what they call the middle path. And I'd like to compliment Ms. Davis because what she has shown in her beautiful book is that there is a middle path for us caregivers to go and be in that liminal space between despair and hope. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to share my voice today.
Lily, thank you for your voice. It's always so important and never more so than during this time when the caregiver population is increasing. Lily, I'm going to place the name of the book in chat as requested, and I'll do that in a moment. But I also have a question for the audience again, and it's one that you posed, and it is for any family caregivers in the audience, what might be a key regret you have in your caregiving journey? I've just placed that in the chat. And as we go on, if any of you in the audience would like to answer that question in chat, we will be collecting those answers. So thank you for posing that to the audience, Lily, and thank you for your contribution. So if you'll close your screen, I will invite Patty to open her screen. Ms. Davis, thank you for being with us today. And thank you. And I'll let her also tell you the name of her book, and I will place it in the chat. So thank you, Patty, and please be.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. And I loved seeing all those little sticky things on Lily's book. That's, I think every author loves to see that, loves to see dog-eared books and markers and everything. Just briefly, the way that my book Floating in the Deep End came about was I started a support group program called Beyond Alzheimer's in 2011. My father died in 2004. And I think, I don't think, I know right after he died, I quite naively thought, okay, I'm done with my journey with Alzheimer's is finished. I can't really believe I felt that way, but I did. And then I realized that the lessons and the insights that I had learned in that time were still filtering into my life, were still with me, and were making a difference in my life. That combined with people coming up to me, sometimes in the grocery store, and telling me about their own experiences with loved ones who had Alzheimer's or some other version of dementia, made me realize that caregivers were not being cared for. And I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning in 2011 and thought, I'm going to start a support group. And I took it to UCLA. David Feinberg was head of UCLA at the time, and they took it immediately. I ran it there for 5 years. Then when he left, the climate there changed, and I moved it to St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, ran it for another year, twice a week. For a variety of reasons, most having to do with time, I wanted to sort of step back and let other people take the helm. And I had the idea of licensing the group to hospitals. 2 hospitals said yes. Many said no, which sadly didn't surprise me because, again, I just don't think that caregivers are given the care that they need. In fact, one doctor in between leaving UCLA and going to St. John's said to me, Alzheimer's is the least profitable area of medicine. So that gives you an indication of the lack of care that that is given to people with dementia and those caring for it. So I then thought, okay, fine. If I can't have the support group be like the AA of caregiver support groups, which was my goal. I'm going to write a book and put all of this information in the book. And that's how Floating in the Deep End came about. It is in part a handbook for the entire journey of caring for someone with dementia, any version of dementia. It's also part memoir, because for me to be sharing insights and giving suggestions to you, you need to know how I came to those ideas, how I came to those suggestions. So there is a lot in there about the 10 years of my father's illness. I want to say right at the top that, because sometimes people would come into the support group and they would say, well, I don't know if I can really call myself a caregiver because I don't need to be there 24/7. We can afford outside help. If you are showing up, you're a caregiver. I mean, obviously my parents could afford to have outside caregivers. At the end of my father's life, the last 3 years of his life, he had nursing care. He was bedridden. So they were fortunate enough to be able to afford that. But if you are showing up, you can provide things that an outside caregiver can't provide. You can provide emotional care. You can provide emotional connection. The other thing that happened often when someone would initially come into the support group is we would ask them, I had a co-facilitator always from the medical field, and we would ask them how they were doing. And people would be shocked because no one had asked them that. I realized at some point, I hadn't even thought about it before, but I realized at some point that in the 10 years of my father's illness, I don't think anyone ever asked me how I was doing. So if you know someone who is a caregiver, ask them how they're doing, not just how the patient that they are caring for, who they're caring for, is doing. Ask them how they're doing, because people forget to do that, right? And the other thing that is really common is that people don't want to address their grief right out of the gate. I have said to many, many people at the early stages of their loved one's illness, how are you doing with your grief? And people have looked at me like I was crazy. Why would I be dealing with my grief? They're still here. We tend to think of grief as something to deal with once someone has died. But Alzheimer's is a death before dying. And you will be well served to inhabit your grief and surrender to your grief at the very beginning. I told a story in this book about a woman I met many years ago who was caring for her husband, not who had Alzheimer's, but who had cancer. This was long before my father was diagnosed. And when she was the sole caregiver, she didn't need to be. She could have afforded to get help, but she chose not to. And so she was the sole caregiver. And when he died, she got agoraphobia. She couldn't leave her house. She would open the door and she would get slammed back in by a panic attack. And she was wise enough to know what it was. She said to me, I never allowed myself to grieve. So that's what happened. I was made to stay in my house until I dealt with the grief that I'd been pushing away. And, it's human nature to want to push grief away. It hurts. We feel like we'll drown there. We don't want to give into that. We don't want to take time to be quiet and still and inhabit the emotions that are coming up in us. And we sort of think that if we keep pushing it away, send it out to the South 40, that it will disintegrate and we'll never have to deal with it. It doesn't work like that. Grief is not biodegradable. It will wait for you and it will come find you. And just like the woman who spoke to me, if it has to come find you, it will bring you to your knees. It will bring you to a standstill until you deal with it. But the thing to remember about grief is that it's not just sorrow. There are other colors on that palette. We grieve because we love. We feel love for the person who is ill. We feel love for the person who is leaving us. And that's why we're grieving. So there's sweetness in that. The other sort of overarching theme that I want to mention that is in this book, along with a lot of very specific things, and I'll bring up a couple of those. But one of the overarching things is ideas is that there's always another way of looking at things. There's a tendency sometimes, and people have said this to me, and I've always said, you know what, this is not a good thing for you to say. People have said, they're just about their loved one. They're just not there anymore. They're gone. They're leaving. They're gone. They're not there anymore. You've just written off a human being. Yes, cognitively, they are leaving. Yes, in terms of their memory and their recognition, they are leaving. But there's still a human being there. There's still a human being with emotions and with needs and with desires. And the reason that I called my support group Beyond Alzheimer's is at the very beginning of my father's illness, I said to myself, I don't believe that his soul can be sick. I don't believe his soul can have Alzheimer's. So my mission really was to always be trying to look beyond the disease, to look at any windows or any apertures that might open up where I could see beyond the disease, see through it, and see his essence, which brings up another point. Alzheimer's, and really any kind of dementia, is a stripping away of the facades and the personas that we all develop to live in this world. And it's a stripping away down to the essence of who that person is. This can be a good thing or a bad thing. In my case, in our case, my father was a very sweet, gentle person. That was the essence of his being. So it made it a lot easier. If your loved one was always a cantankerous, difficult, nasty person, you're in for a bumpy ride. That's just the way it is. And you're going to have to accept that. Well, you don't have to, but it would be a good idea if you accepted it, which is another sort of big theme, acceptance. Alzheimer's is running the show. Dementia is going to do what it's going to do at the pace that it does it. If you think that you're going to try to control it, you're really in for a bumpy ride. A friend of mine whose father has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's we were talking recently about her situation, and it's really looking like it would be best if her father was put into a facility for a number of reasons. And she said, I have so much on my plate right now with my child and everything. She said, I figured I'd deal with this after the holidays. I said, oh, well, that's good. But Alzheimer's doesn't care about your schedule. Alzheimer's is going to do what it's going to do when it's going to do it, right? So one of the big lessons of this experience is that you're not in control. You're in control of how you deal with the situations that come up. I'm not advocating being in denial or sitting back and doing nothing. But if you think that you're going to somehow control the pace of the disease, you're not. Sorry, my cat is joining the conversation. She does that sometimes. And a lot of what happens in caregiving is that people behave a certain way with their loved one for deeper reasons than just the situation at hand. Particularly if it's a parent. There are a lot of things that come into play depending on your history with that parent. I've had people say things like, well, they were having trouble buttoning their shirt, but I really wanted them to do it. I felt like it would be good for them to remember how to do it. No, what would be good for them is for you to accept that they don't remember how to do that anymore and do it for them. And what's really at play there is, if I can get them to button their shirt, then the disease hasn't progressed any further, and I've somehow reined it in, right? But it doesn't work like that. So it really is, it's a balancing exercise between acceptance and taking on the challenges that are presented in the context of this disease. Some of the really important specific things at the very beginning, taking away the car keys. You know, I try to never tell people what they should or shouldn't do in the context of this illness. I make exceptions, and the driving issue is one of those exceptions. Once someone is diagnosed, the doctor is mandated to tell the DMV. The DMV, however, is slow. And I don't care if they're just driving a block. I don't care if you've driven with them and nothing happened. They cannot be driving. I have written about in this book and have brought up to many people the incident years ago in Los Angeles when a man named George Weller drove through the Santa Monica farmers market and mowed down 69 people. Bodies were bouncing off the hood of his car. That's about as bad as it can get. That family lost everything. And I have told this to people many times, and I've said to them, the reason I'm telling you this is I want to scare you, because that is as bad as it can get. So the driving thing is a really big thing, and it's usually not easy. Sometimes people will give up their car, usually not. I've had people get very creative and go in the dead of night and disable the car or drive it away and say it's stolen and they can't afford to get a new car for them. The good thing now is that there are rideshare services. There are things like Uber and Lyft where you can set up an account for someone. So you're taking something away, but you're also giving them something, right? So, you know, it's really important to remember there's always a different way of dealing with something. It's not just, you're not just taking something away. You also have the opportunity now to offer something as a substitute. And that's a really good tip in any of the situations that come up. When someone gets stuck in a loop, change the scenery, take them outside. Usually that works. Sometimes it doesn't, but usually that works. You know, they're looking at something different and they get out of the loop that they're in. Down the line, bathing usually becomes an issue. I'm not sure why, but my thought is that showers become scary because water coming down on someone is scary. So a bath usually works better. Sometimes that doesn't even work, and sometimes you just have to go to sponge baths, but know that that is coming. One of the big things that people hold out as this kind of terrifying thing is when they forget my name and they don't remember my name. And I understand why that seems terrifying, but if you set that up as something scary, then that's what it's going to be. Instead, it's better to say, you know what, I don't know what I'm going to feel when that happens. When that happened to me with my father, it actually was kind of a sweet moment. I was leaving my parents' house. I suspected for a while that my father didn't remember that I was his daughter. I was a familiar face because I was there often, but I suspected he didn't really know who I was. And I was leaving the house one day and I said, "Bye, Dad, I love you." And he looked very surprised and he said, "Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much." And I thought, wow, someone who he apparently no longer recognizes as his daughter just told him that they loved him. And his reaction was to be grateful for that. I'm not sure if someone who I didn't know intimately said, "I love you." I'm not sure that would be my reaction. So it said something again about his essence and his personality. So it actually, it plugged me in again to the sweetness of who he is. There is always another way of looking at things. Someone in my support group said once that his mother, who he was visiting in a facility every few days, was always sitting by the window and looking very sad and lonely. And he said, it makes me so sad because I'm the only interaction she has. She apparently doesn't socialize that much. I'm the only interaction she has. And I said, hold on. I said, you have no idea where she has drifted off to in her head. She could be walking on a beach in the Bahamas with a gorgeous man at sunset, and then you show up and ruin the whole thing, right? We don't know where someone has drifted off to in their heads. So it's really important to remember that our view of what's going on with that person is not the whole story. What our eyes and our ears are telling us is not the whole story. And if you think about it, our physical senses are not that reliable anyway. People thought the earth was flat because they saw boats drive off over the edge. So, right, there is always another dimension. There's always another way of seeing things. I want to just finish with a quote. I have quotes at the end of every section in this book because I love quotes. I've kept a quote book since I was in high school. And Henry Ellis said, all of life is a fine mingling of holding on and letting go. And I think that is so applicable to dealing with dementia. We have to let go of a lot. We have to let go of what is familiar about another person. We have to let go of the memories that they could share with us, but we don't have to let go of those memories. And we don't have to let go of the love that we have for that person. I don't believe that dementia destroys the love between two people, even if they don't remember your name. Their heart remembers that they love you. Their soul remembers that they love you. And your two souls are connected because no disease can destroy that.
Patty, thank you so very, very much. That is a beautiful thought to end your section on. At this time, I would like to, yes, and other people are noticing that too. That was beautiful, truly. Roy and Lily, if you would open your cameras and your microphones now as well. I want to begin to ask a few questions to prompt this panel discussion, but we have one right away from an attendee. This person writes, when I first learned that my mom was diagnosed as having dementia, it was both a relief to have a label for her behavior, but also a crushing blow. And I didn't know what to do, what to ask, what to expect. Mental health is something that we didn't discuss as a family or with friends. I felt very alone. So from individual perspectives altogether, what advice do you have for people when they first learn about a dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis based on your experience?
Do you want me to take that or?
Yes, please feel free to start.
Well, I think that you do have to educate yourself, sadly. A friend of mine whose friend has a husband with Lewy body dementia was just told by her doctor to stop calling him as much because he's very busy, which is horrible, but I don't think uncommon. So sadly, I think you do have to educate yourself. She didn't know what Lewy body dementia was. And that, in my book, I do go through all the different versions of dementia and give you a little encapsulated, description of each one. But, it's as accessible as a Google search. And I would suggest that people you have to inform yourself. You really do.
And every dementia, every experience within each dementia is different too, of course. Liz, what would you have to say about that?
I'm going to be silly and say, buy this book. This book was
That's not silly.
I really mean it sincerely, because what's lovely about the book is that there are wonderful factual descriptions of what we're going to face. Then there's that wonderful, beautiful soul of the Reagan family showing through with how Ms. Davis has taught us that, we have to let go, but we also have to understand things. I learned myself, though, that find the social worker. If there are any social workers in the audience, I love you all. They're the ones who have been my most helpful friend in this whole medical system, which is not a system.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
Roy, how about you? How would you answer that?
Thank you. I completely agree with Patty and with Lily. So knowledge is power, and we need resources. We need the social workers. I would add that, I'll take it back to self-care and sustainability of the caregiver or of the family member. So while we want to inform ourselves, for a lot of us, we can lose ourselves in the information and thus avoid dealing with our own emotional process. And so can we tend to this transition that we're in? Because this is a life changer, right? That diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so can we just turn inward and notice what we're experiencing and be really honest about our own fears and our own vulnerabilities, and create that kind of intimacy with self, because we're really setting the stage for what is yet to come. And if we can't get comfortable with this kind of self-awareness, that kind of cultivation to pay attention to what's happening inside, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for real difficulty. So yeah, I think that's just part of making that transition.
Can I,
oh,
can I
I'm
just add
sorry. Go ahead.
something? I just
Mhm.
wanted to add something to what Roy just said, that in terms of that going inside, I've said a lot of times to people, instead of initially asking, what should I do in a particular situation in this environment, ask first, who am I? Who am I being in this situation? Because if it's a parent and you're still that resentful 17-year-old or resentful 30-year-old, you're not going to do very well. Form will always follow content. So look inward at who you're being. It is difficult. I think it was Roy mentioned earlier, or maybe it was Lily, I can't remember, about parenting, becoming a parent. I think it was Lily, becoming a parent to your parent. That's a really hard thing to do. But this is, I know I said to myself, you're going to have to grow up, right? I came from a very fractured, not cohesive family. And I thought, you know what, that's not going to serve you well. You're going to have to grow up, rise above that, and show up as an adult, open to learning and growing from this experience.
That's lovely. And, the circumstances can be so chaotic. We can just get swept away in the situation. So what Patty's describing is, I think, a stepping back and looking at oneself kind of objectively. And so I want to just throw into the conversation this idea of setting an intention. So how do I want to show up for this? Who's the person I want to be in these circumstances? And of course, you're going to drop that thread from time to time, because you will get swept up in it. But if you can use that intention as a touch point, it can really be a source of support. Like, okay, am I being the grown up in this situation despite what happened in my crazy family for so many years,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Patty mentioned surrendering to your grief. I'd like you all to speak to that. There are good days and bad days. And also, Patty, you mentioned, it was a great quote about grief is not biodegradable, is that what you said? Can you speak a little bit, each of you, or with one another, about how to manage that grief? Because it is going to come up on a regular basis.
I think you have to take that time for yourself. I think, one of in our desire to not deal with grief, Alzheimer's offers you a great ground for not dealing with it, because you can just keep yourself so busy. Like, I don't have time to take 20 minutes and sit there, or a half hour and sit there for myself and sink into my own emotions. Well, you know, you can call someone to sit with your loved one. If you don't have outside help, or, you know, you need to do that for yourself. You're in this picture too. And I think you really, again, need to take a step back and go, okay, I'm kind of using the disease to avoid the emotions. You're going to be a better caregiver. Not only are you going to be better for yourself, but you're going to be a better caregiver if you allow yourself to go through those emotions. And you will not drown in those waters. It will feel like it sometimes, but you will not drown there. And there will be tears, and there will be pain, and there will be sorrow, but there will also be beauty. And I have to tell you that, you know, there are people who have a loved one with Alzheimer's, or a parent with Alzheimer's or some other kind of dementia with whom they never got along. And maybe that parent was even abusive to them. And they miss they are anxious for longing for the kind of grief that other people experience. They're longing for that sweetness of grief. How are they going to have that? Because this is not a person they're going to miss, right? So they have to accept the fact that their grief is going to be different. Their grief is going to be a continuation of the grief they felt all their life of never having a parent who knew how to be one, right?
That's what I found so touching about Ms. Davis's book. I think it's the section that has the most stickies, is with her trademark honesty. She said we are experiencing a loss while that parent is right in front of us because of the loss of what Alzheimer's does. And so I've just learned the new term for myself, anticipatory grief. And so I just always thought grief came, and especially with an immigrant family, you never lost anybody because there was nobody to lose. You were just a nuclear family. So I was very late in life before my father died. So I realized that her parsing out what it means to have a loss and the different types of grief was what I learned the most from. And that really is the section that has the most stickies. I'm going to go back and keep reading that, because as mother declines, I'm going to need further help like what you've laid out. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Roy, have you seen that anticipatory grief in the people that you've been serving?
Absolutely. It's very real. And, you know, it's so complex, as Patty sort of pointed at, when it comes to dealing with a dementia-related illness. But what I wanted to say on this grief topic generally is that, you know, God bless caregivers. You know, so often they're so focused on the person they're caring for that they can't really look at their own care. So I want to just say regarding grief that I've seen this so often, that when family members don't tend to their own grief or their own issues around loss and death, they project really unskillfully upon the person they're caring for. So another way to put this is, you know, if we as caregivers don't deal with our own grief, we're not going to be available to hold the grief experience of the person we're caring for.
Yeah.
Because it's going to trigger too much for us. So this is another reason why it's so important for us to really tend to our own grief. And when it comes to a dementia-related illness, you know, this gets really complicated, because there's this natural tendency to just put off the kind of work, if you will, that one needs to do before they die. And because people living with dementia will have, you know, they go in and out of clarity, they may think they can deal with this later. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is, as a caregiver, we want to provide a container for the person we're caring for to really process whatever grief they're experiencing, or to do the work that needs to be done before they die, you know, in terms of completing relationships. And so if we're going to provide that container to facilitate that conversation, it's just really necessary that we deal with our own issues regarding grief and loss. So it's an important area.
I think, just to touch on something that Roy just said, I think a lot of times people forget that the person who has been diagnosed with dementia in the earlier stages is grieving. They're aware of what they're losing. The earlier stages disease are much more difficult than the latter stages.
Mhm.
Because the latter stages, they've drifted, wherever they've drifted off to, they're pretty much okay there, you know?
Yeah.
The earlier stages, they wake up every day knowing that they're losing something. They're losing cognition, they're losing memory. Things look unfamiliar. And, you know, sometimes people have said, well, you know, my loved one seems depressed. Maybe I should get them antidepressants. Well, hold on. Maybe they're just sad, right? They have a disease. They know they have a disease. How about talk to them about their grief, you know, while you still can?
Miss Davis, on that point, that very honest letter that your late father wrote, have you gone back to look at it a couple more times? Because he was announcing that, and that was so rare in that time.
Yeah, it was a very brave and gracious thing for him to do. And it did make us, you know, sort of the poster family for Alzheimer's, but that was okay because I felt like, you know, I had this sort of support system around me, even though people weren't talking about the disease, at least everybody knew it. And when he was still going out in public, which was for years, really, it was okay. I mean, I told the story of when I was going on a walk with him and, you know, the Secret Service agents were following us and a dog behind a gate was barking at me. He was barking back at the dog. And at first I was like mortified and I thought, oh my God, you know, people are going to see Ronald Reagan barking at a dog. And then I thought, oh, who cares? The whole world knows he has Alzheimer's. He's having fun. Who cares if he's barking at a dog, right?
I think that's a really beautiful point, Patty. Sometimes caregivers are embarrassed by their loved ones.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to have a more age-friendly and dementia-friendly world, because more people are walking around in various stages of dementia. And to be able to accept and embrace those people, no matter at what stage they are, is a wonderful thing.
Well, it's also why, you know, a lot of times people will not tell friends or people in the workplace that someone has dementia. And I mean, again, it's not my place to tell people what to do, but I would strongly suggest that that's not the best path to go down, because other people are going to notice that something is different. And it's far better if they know what it is. They know that this person has been diagnosed with, you know, either mild cognitive impairment or already diagnosed with Alzheimer's, so that they can behave accordingly, rather than sitting there going, what is wrong with this person? Did they start drinking? What, you know, they're going to think something. It's better that they know.
You know, in the audience today, we have a few people who write blogs and share their experiences as a way to get the word out to other caregivers and also for themselves. It's a way of managing a coping strategy. So one person asks, what advice do you have to get caregiving help and information in front of people? You'll all have your individual responses, but I'd like to hear from everybody.
Well, you mean like the actual getting outside help situation?
Yeah, and further information. Of course, we're citing the book again. I think that's going to be a valuable resource.
Well, I think getting outside help is really a good idea. I understand it's difficult with COVID, but I think I know my next door neighbor who recently passed away had round the clock care at the end, and they were very careful with, you know, obviously now with vaccinations and masks and all of that. I always think that finding a reputable caregiver agency is the best way to go, because first of all, that person's been vetted. And also if something happens, if they get a cold or they get in a car accident or something, or their car breaks down or something, there's a backup. So, you know, when I was running my group, I would look into several agencies so that I could recommend them to people. So I think that is the most dependable way to go.
And I think something that Ms. Davis said earlier was that naming it, you know, you are a family caregiver. If you Google I bring soup to my neighbor, you're not going to find the resources. But when you put in the word combination, search engine optimization, family caregiver, we're lucky, as fractured as the long-term care system is in this country, there are still right now, ways to find things, starting what they call the AAA, but it's really the area agencies on aging. And then, of course, something like Institute on Aging. What a godsend you all are for the Bay Area, Catlin, really important. And the Zen Caregiving Project.
Yes.
But the key thing is what Ms. Davis said, name it, you are a family caregiver.
Yeah.
And, to an earlier point, naming it to friends and family, because, there are going to be those people who they're not going to make a meal. They're not going to go over and sit with someone, but they'll get on that computer and they'll find for you where those resources are. I just also wanted to give a shout out. In California, we have the CRCs, or the Caregiver Resource Centers.
Yes.
So to avail yourself of those, and they exist in other states, they're just under a different name. So, yeah.
I would like to hear from the three of you. Any questions that you have for one another?
I'm good. I can't think of any at the moment.
I have one for Patty. I
Oh,
really appreciated your chapter that focused quite a bit on meditation. And you mentioned Eckhart Tolle, who's a great teacher of meditation and did so much work to make meditation, or to pull it more into the mainstream, I would say. But I wonder if you, for folks who haven't read your book yet, if you might say something on how you've benefited from that practice in your experience of being a caregiver or in your life generally.
yes. Like everybody else, it's hard to silence your mind. So some days I'm better at meditation than others. Sometimes I doze off when I start to meditate. That's okay. I had to forgive myself for that. Sometimes it's like, okay, I didn't get an A+ in meditation today because I nodded off for 10 minutes or something. But it's, just physiologically, there have been enough studies done now on meditation that we know the physiological benefits from it. In fact, when I was running my support group at UCLA, there was somebody at UCLA doing a study on meditation and caregiver stress. And a number of people in my group actually participated in it. I didn't, because it involved MRIs and I'm very claustrophobic, and plus hospital. So I didn't do it, but they did. And the findings were that it did help, that it helps people's heart rate. It helps people, obviously, with their stress levels. So that alone should be an incentive to do it. But also, I think, it does, once you get silent and still, it pulls you down into the emotional reality. So it's not uncommon to, at least in my experience, to sit there and start breathing, to meditate and start weeping, because it takes you down to that core of emotion that needs to come up. And that's okay. If 20 minutes later you say to yourself, well, I didn't really meditate, I just sat there and cried, that's okay. Yeah. Then that's what you needed to do right then. That's the space that you needed to be in right then. And you needed to get silent and still, and for that to come up and for you to inhabit that space.
Beautiful.
One of the attendees actually said, when people ask how you're doing, maybe they don't always want to hear the truth. They want to hear something a little upbeat. I will pose that to each of you, but Lily, can we start with you on that? Have you experienced that, where you find that they don't really want to hear, it's just a polite question?
I actually responded to the person. I said, they may not wish to listen. I think what I'm learning from today and from the book is I am going to have to become more vocal about my needs and and that's what I've learned from the book, is there is an honesty that you have to give yourself. And I think that's what I'm going to start doing. I have not done enough of that until now.
I think when people ask you, you know, how you're doing, I think it's totally fair to say, well, do you really want to know? Do you want me to just say fine and move on, or do you really want to know? Right. And I mean, and that doesn't mean that, I think, you know, to give other people the benefit of the doubt, if they think that you're going to talk to them for 20 minutes about how you're doing, they might not want to listen for 20 minutes. Right. So if they do really want to know, I think it's also probably considerate to say, listen, I'm not going to make you stand here for 20 or 30 minutes and tell you everything is going, but I will answer you honestly that, you know, today's maybe a rough day, or today is a better day than yesterday. Yesterday was really hard, you know?
And Roy, both you and Patty have had these groups where people come together and talk honestly. How long does it take, in your estimation, for people actually to get to a point where they can really answer without artifice?
You know, if they're talking to other caregivers, not long at all. You know, I've been just amazed at how quickly people fall into, you know, intimacy with complete strangers. There's something about seeing themselves in the other, and it can happen quite quickly. That's not to say there are some people who are just, you know, more cautious or reserved, but as Patty well knows, I'm sure, you know, it really depends on what kind of container you create. Can you create a safe space in these support groups? And I'd say any support group facilitator worth their salt knows how to make people feel safe very quickly. Right. So people will share.
Right. I think, you know, there is a familiarity of experience. And if you're around other people who are on the same journey as you are at whatever stage they're at, I think there is an assumption that you're not going to be judged, that you can say things in that context or in that space that you couldn't say to somebody else, and that you probably shouldn't say to somebody else. I mean, we laughed a lot in my group. You know, people with Alzheimer's do and say funny things. Yeah. You might not want to take that humor and that laughter to someone who has no experience with a person with Alzheimer's, because they might think that you're being unkind or laughing at that person. Right. But other people who are going through the same experience know full well that sometimes it's funny.
Roy, you've been such a thought leader in this caregiving space. If I were to give you $1 million, like you could take a sabbatical, what aspect of all this do you want to research or learn more for yourself? Because you've always been someone who's been ahead of the curve.
Well, I was saying to Patty earlier, thank you for that question, Lily. I love it. That, you know, these kinds of support groups, this desire to take into health systems, this kind of caregiver support, we're really ahead of the curve. So health systems generally, insurance companies, the government, they're just catching up with us. They're catching up with what we know already. So it would really be about increasing public awareness of the issue at hand, you know, the prevalence of family caregiving, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, the desperate need for caregivers to find not just practical support, but emotional support. So support groups are wonderful, but, you know, can we provide tools for people so that they can build their emotional resilience?
Yeah.
Because it's beautiful to teach someone how to keep themselves safe when moving someone, say, from a bed to a wheelchair, or how to change a dressing, or, you know, what the resources are to get someone to their doctor's appointment. But are we teaching people how to be emotionally resilient through meditation, compassion, you know, death awareness, you know, getting comfortable with the conversation around death and loss, boundaries, etc. So that's what we would do at our small nonprofit that's constantly struggling with $1 million. So thank you for the question.
I have to say, we're about at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody again for being here, and I will be sending some of the chat questions out to the participants so that there is that further sense of community. And of course, we want to recommend that everybody gets Patty's book, Floating in the Deep End. There it is. Patty Davis. I think if you're in a caregiver support group, that's a wonderful place to be. And this is a book that one could use within one support group too. Somebody says, leaving to buy the book right now. Wonderful. Any last words from each of you to wrap up for today?
May I just start by saying thank you. I have already learned so much, and I am so grateful that there are thought leaders like both of you out there. We're desperate. Our nation is only going to increase with these needs. So thank you for being the thought leaders that you both are.
And you too, Lily.
Lily, thank you so much. It's always a delight to listen to you tell your story. And Patty, thank you for the work you've been doing and for this book. And I want to thank everyone, all the people who have participated, for all the work you're doing out there in the world. Yeah, so it's nice to be here.
Yes,
Patty,
thank you.
final word.
I so appreciate being included in this, and I've learned a lot as well. And I'm very grateful for everybody's work, all their contributions in this area.
And again, thank you all, everyone, for participating today on behalf of IOA and AARP. Get Patty's book, and we will be ending the webinar in just a moment. I'll be staying in touch with the panelists via email. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.